Welcome to this edition of Jabba, the vocal part of the networking magazine. Neil De Silva joins me today to talk about his new book on type 2 diabetes. Hi, Neil. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sanj, and thank you for having me on your show today. Much appreciated.
Our pleasure. In August 2012, I know that your father died of a condition relating to undiagnosed type 2 diabetes. And the point of getting you on the show is to discuss some of the myths and talk about your new book on type 2 diabetes in the hope that it would help other people. So if I may, I'm going to start with some of the questions that have come in from our audience and some of the questions that I've designed to ask you, if that's okay.
That's great.
Okay, so let's talk about your book. What inspired you to write a book on type 2 diabetes? Where did that inspiration come from?
Well, as you mentioned, Sanj, I lost my dad in August 2012. He had a heart attack. I was talking to the coroner at the time, and the coroner asked me about type 2 diabetes, whether my dad had mentioned it before, and I was quite taken aback actually, because my dad and I were very close. Mm-hmm. We had a great relationship, and he never mentioned once about the complications of type 2 or him being type 2. And it turns out, to cut a long story short in relation to losing my dad, that he had type 2 diabetes. The coroner estimated he'd had it probably around 5 years.
Wow.
And in that 5 years, it had done a lot of damage to his body. So he died completely out of the blue. He was 66 years old. Now, a few weeks after my dad died, and this is in the same month, so this is towards the end of August 2012, mm-hmm. I decided to have a well-man check. I was of a certain age, and I thought, you know what? I probably need to get myself checked out. I knew I wasn't healthy. That was the point. I knew I wasn't healthy. I knew I was overweight. I just didn't know how bad it was. So They did all the tests, and the doctor came back and said to me, I had really high cholesterol, really high blood pressure. I was clinically obese. And I also had a blood sugar level that was in the type 2 diabetes range, which was a massive shock given the events of a few weeks before. Yeah. So the inspiration for the book came from ultimately losing my dad, but then on my own personal journey to try to deal with the disease myself, and not just deal with type 2 diabetes, but in dealing with type 2 diabetes and dealing with the high blood sugar levels, actually improving my health. And that was key for me. It wasn't just dealing with one problem. It was trying to improve my diet, my health, my lifestyle, my habits.
Right. And your dad prompted that. It was that check? Because not all men, I mean, I've got to admit, not all men want to go and get themselves checked out. It's a well-known fact. Was it actually your father sadly passing that prompted that? Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Absolutely. I look back now and I think, had he not died, I almost certainly wouldn't have reflected on my own health. And I think reflecting on our own health from time to time is not a bad thing.
Okay, so what is your main gain for this book in terms of readership? What do you want the audience to identify with, particularly as a message in your book?
I think the key message to the book is that type 2 diabetes is not unavoidable. Mm-hmm. So it can be prevented. And I'm a great believer that prevention is better than cure, but it can be prevented if people aren't type 2 diabetic. And also if they do have type 2 diabetes, to understand that it's not, despite what mainstream medical science would have you believe, it is actually reversible. You're not necessarily going to be on medication for the rest of your life if you make the right changes. Now, there's no guarantee to reverse type 2 diabetes, but from my experience, it can be reversed a lot more often than it can't. Okay. But the individual needs to put the effort in to get to that goal.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because obviously I think everybody knows somebody who has diabetes type 2. Can you share some practical tips or strategies, something that a reader can identify with in terms of management of diabetes?
Okay, I mean, when we look at today's society, we eat a lot of processed foods. In my book, I talk about my 2 golden rules that I teach my clients. The first is my 10,000 year rule, and the second is the catch it, grow it, rear it rule. If you'd like me, I can elaborate a little bit on those.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay. So 10,000 year rule. Think about the things that we used to eat 10,000 years ago. So we used to eat the vegetables that we grew, the fruit that we picked from the trees, the nuts, the seeds, the berries that we foraged, the fish that we caught, and the animals that we hunted. Now, in 10,000 years, the human body has not changed very much, but our diet has changed almost beyond recognition, where 80% of most people's diets, at the very least, consist of food that has been through a factory of some description and has been processed, either processed or even worse, ultra processed, where it's merely edible. It's not necessarily food. And so the 10,000 year rule is essentially a guide that says, look, when you're making your decisions about what you're eating, what you're drinking, just think for a moment before you eat it. Could I have got this 10,000 years ago? Is it natural? Is it unprocessed? Is it natural vegetables? Is it natural fish, natural meat? Or is it a processed, dehydrated meal that you have to add water to? And then even then, when when it's rehydrated, it doesn't resemble real food. Because the human body is designed to run on proper real food. It's not designed to run on the stuff that comes out of factories with numerous ingredients in it, and many of which can't even be pronounced.
Yeah.
The other rule is very similar. So catch it, grow it, rear it. Again, before you eat whatever it is you're choosing to eat, just think to yourself, could I have caught this? Could I have grown it? Or could I have reared it? And actually, when you stop and think for a moment, it's quite profound. Those six words, catch it, grow it, rear it. When you actually break that down and you look at the types of diets that most people have these days, certainly in the Western diet, most of the food that they eat can't be caught, can't be grown in it, and certainly can't be reared, because it comes in packets, it comes in tins.
It's an interesting take. Yeah, it's an interesting.
Yeah,
right.
And it's 2 principles that I've really stuck with over the years. It's 2 principles that certainly served me well, and that I try to help my clients with. Other things to consider are things like making sure that your diet is balanced. Balanced diet's really important. Not just about reducing sugar, because lots of people with type 2 diabetes will switch from sugar to sweeteners.
Yeah.
And artificial sweeteners cause their own plethora
they have
of
their
problems.
own problems. Yeah.
So it is about balance, particularly of the macronutrient groups, so the fats, the carbs, and the proteins. It's about including physical activity, even if it's just walking for 15, 20 minutes a day. It's about mindset. It's about stress management, sleep quality. It's also about education.
Right.
What happens is when someone's diagnosed, they're given medication, and they might be referred to a diabetes course for a couple of weeks, perhaps.
Sure.
They're given real basic information, and then they're kind of sent on their merry way. And I see this a lot where people come to me and they say, I went to my doctors, I went on this course, this recommended course from my doctor, and I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. There's so much conflicting information. Right. So there's lots of good sources of information out there on the management and reversal of type 2. I happen to be one of them, I hasten to add. But find someone that you trust. I'd also recommend that if there are listeners out there with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, or they're worried about that they might be going down that route, to find someone who's been through the journey.
Yeah, I suppose they can identify with that. Yeah,
absolutely. One of the things that gives me that congruency is I've lived the experience. I know what it's like to be significant.
And on that point, I wanted to ask you about, I don't know if this ties in very well, but the emotional, psychological aspects that nobody really talks about. Having a condition can be emotionally destructive. psychologically destructive, and it can affect your everyday life. How does your book sort of address those topics?
My book does delve into the emotional and the psychological aspects of type 2 management and reversal. For most people, when they're given that diagnosis, unless they kind of knew it was going to happen, it's normally quite a bombshell. It normally has a big impact on them.
I can imagine.
Mentally and emotionally.
Yeah.
So whilst in the book I talk about things like diet and exercise, which of course are absolutely pivotal.
Yeah.
I do talk about mental well-being. I do talk about stress management, sleep quality. Sleep is a big factor in blood sugar
because nobody
management.
really talks about those things, to be honest. It's just go on a diet and get better.
Go on a diet, don't eat sugar, and switch sugars to sweeteners. And it's I see it so much, and it really is a holistic approach.
Okay, let's talk about myths a little bit, because I guess that there are some major myths about diabetes 2, type 2. So what's one of the main ones? Because I'm going to bring this in a bit later in the conversation, but what's the main myth about diabetes, a misconception that's quite common to everyone?
One of them is about the elimination of food groups. I did kind of touch on it a little bit earlier, but what happens is when someone's diagnosed, they will often go on I'm not going to name particular brands of diets,
Sure.
but they'll cut out carbohydrates. And within the realm of type 2 diabetes, carbohydrates are wrongly vilified because there's different types of carbs, and it's certain carbs that affect blood sugars more than others. And the problem is when you go on elimination diets, when you cut out major food groups or macronutrients, you can often set yourself up for other problems down the line. So the elimination of major food groups is not necessary. It's just about balance.
What about the research that's gone into this book and the expertise that you've drawn upon whilst you were sort of assembling the book? Was it something you had to do research for? Was it something that came quite natural to you, given that you yourself suffered with diabetes 2?
Interestingly, when I was diagnosed, I knew nothing about nutrition.
Right.
At the time, I was running my marketing company.
Right.
And whilst I was good at marketing, I knew nothing about nutrition. So for me, I had the choice. I could either go on a handful of medication every day, and 11 years down the line, I'd probably be on even more medication just to keep me alive. Or I could see if there were other ways. And I'm not anti-medication. I do stress that. Mm-hmm. But my journey began with the fact that I wasn't content to just pop pills.
Right.
Because, when you take pills for one thing, sometimes they can cause other issues.
Sure.
So my research began by reading books. I just read loads and loads of books and and this, I cannot stress this enough. If you read books about type 2 diabetes, and mine included, and you don't act on it, you may not have, you may as well not have read it in the first place. So if you are concerned about type 2 and you do pick up a book, as I did, many books, then you need to put into action what you learn. But then obviously my personal journey, I became really interested in nutrition. I lost the weight. I reversed my diabetes, my type 2 diabetes. I brought my cholesterol down. I brought my blood pressure down, and people were asking me, what were you doing? How were you doing it? And I thought, you know what? This could be a really interesting shift in career, because I was in my early 40s at that time, and it's not a traditional time for people to switch careers completely. Yeah. But I found I had a passion, not for helping businesses make money, as I was doing in my marketing role, but for helping people to literally change their lives. And so I took it seriously. I became qualified. I took my qualifications in 2014, and and I continually grow and increase my knowledge year by year. I read lots of books on the topic as well. Yeah, because it is a constantly evolving subject.
Well, on this subject of like identifying with the readership, I mean, you've got two types of people really. You've got those who are newly diagnosed and those who are actively trying to manage diabetes type 2. what advice would you give a newbie who is, I call them newbies, but somebody who's just been freshly diagnosed? Would you tell them that they have to take a little bit from every source and make a conscientious decision based on what they find? Should they find a specialist like you who deals with type 2 diabetes? What kind of advice would you give someone like that?
Okay, well, in terms of accessing specialist advice, I do know people, myself included, who went on the journey themselves.
Right.
And kudos to people that can do that, because we are quite a rarity, because it is an incredibly difficult and challenging journey at times. I found personally, and other people who have done it on their own have said a similar thing. So if you are concerned, don't be afraid to reach out to an expert like myself, who will guide you and help you and hold your hand through the journey. As I say, it can be quite challenging at times. Just to go back for a moment about the book. The book will help people who are not type 2 diabetic yet, but have a diet and lifestyle that will likely lead them down that route. It will also help people who are pre-diabetic, which is in that middle ground. So they've got blood sugars that are higher than normal, but not quite as high as the diabetic range. So they're in that no man's land, where if they don't make any changes, they will almost certainly end up as a type 2 diabetic. But to answer your question about people who are newly diagnosed, number one, if you're newly diagnosed, have hope that it can be reversed. Okay. You're not necessarily going to be on medication for the rest of your life if you take the right types of action. And my book covers things like diet. As a nutritionist, as you would expect, a big part of the book is about diet and nutrition. And in fact, to be fair, diet and nutrition probably is the key area that needs to be addressed. Right. But it talks about diet, exercise, obviously mental health, habit changing, lifestyle changes. And in terms of the newly diagnosed type 2 diabetic, it can be a bit overwhelming. They're either hit with a barrage of information, or they're given very little information to work with. My book will take them through some really easy steps and help them to make small adjustments. Sometimes it's the small adjustments, but that are done consistently that last and make make a long-term difference.
Let's talk about the latest advancements and treatments, because I think technology has crept into every aspect of health, more so in the last decade than previously. What sort of advancements are there, or treatments, in terms of diabetes type 2?
There's some really interesting advancements in medication. Now, the traditional medication for type 2 diabetes is metformin. Normally, metformin is the first medication that someone's put onto, and then hopefully that works. And sometimes the dose will be increased, and if it doesn't work, then other medication has to be introduced. But there's always advances in medication, and these act on different parts of the body. Right. So some work on the liver, some work on the pancreas, some work on the kidneys, and some work on the digestive system. And depending on what your doctor recommends, will depend on the route that they take you down. Wow. The other thing is CGMs. CGMs, constant glucose monitoring systems, are quite a new phenomenon, particularly in the UK. And the traditional way of measuring blood sugar levels has been through the finger prick. Right. And it's quite intrusive. And if you want to monitor your blood sugars properly, regular finger pricking is recommended in that sense, because you need to know how the meal you've just eaten is affecting your blood sugars. It's all about knowledge. Knowledge gives empowerment. Empowerment makes way for change. With a CGM, you don't have to finger prick. It literally sits on your arm. I actually trialed one earlier this year for a month.
I think I saw an advert or something on television, or maybe it was in a magazine, about the thing you stick on your arm and it talks to an app
with your phone. Yeah, fascinating. I mean, as an ex-type 2 diabetic, it was fascinating. As someone who's now not type 2 diabetic, it was still really interesting. I actually learned a lot from having the machine attached to my arm. It's only a little disc. It's about the size of it's a bit bigger than a 2p piece. Yeah. But it's a really interesting piece of kit, and if anyone out there really wants to get to grips with their type 2 and wants to understand, it's about the understanding.
It's data, really isn't it? Yeah.
It's the
data. Processing of data.
And you start to learn, if that plate of white rice spikes your blood sugar up into double figures, then you know what? You might think twice about having it next time, or you might cut the portion size down. Yeah. And there's a couple of other quick things as well. There's some interesting advancements in artificial pancreas. Now, this predominantly affects type 1 diabetics, but they're considering the use of that for type 2 diabetes as well. And what it does is it actually, rather than injecting, and most type 2 diabetics will never need to inject insulin, but sometimes it is necessary. Yeah. Because the medication just isn't necessarily doing what it should do, the oral medication. Yeah. So traditionally it's type 1 diabetics that inject, but occasionally some type 2s will. Mm-hmm. Now what this system is rather than injecting a set amount by syringe, it actually almost intravenously releases insulin based on the individual's blood glucose levels at that time. It's quite an amazing system. Yeah. But that's still quite new technology.
Yeah. But I mean, it's ever evolving. I know that, technology is just leaping forward, and, there are sort of, stories of new medications out for different treatments every day. So yeah, it's pretty amazing.
But then it comes back to my point about, if you can avoid it in the first place, correct, then you haven't got to worry about the cure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, let's talk about is there a personal story in your book that you believe will resonate with the reader, in particular? Is there a personal story, one of your favorites in your long journey with diabetes type 2?
Yeah, I think my personal journey, I would like to think that it really inspires people who are either recently diagnosed or have been type 2 for some time, because I feel for you. I felt that desperation. I felt that confusion. I felt that anger. I felt that guilt that, I brought this upon myself. I've got a family. I had emotional issues where, is this going to kill me? Is it going to cut my life short, or my quality of life? Is that going to be affected? So there was loads of emotional, turmoil. I really rode the emotional roller coaster when I was going through my journey in dealing with type 2 diabetes, as I'm sure many people who are listening to this that have type 2 will relate to. But it was my personal journey that empowered me. Now, when someone is diagnosed, you either have a choice to just carry on doing what you're doing and just popping the medication, and that's the individual's right, and I fully respect that. But I wanted something better. I wanted something better for me and for my family. And in writing the book, I wanted to tap into my personal journey of losing my dad as well, but my personal journey of something can be done. You do have hope for the future.
And that's an important message, isn't it? That for when you are suffering, the word hope is a very important word.
Absolutely, because that's the thing that lacks the most. At the point when someone is diagnosed, I can only talk from personal experience, but I'm sure others will relate to this. At the point that you are diagnosed, you're given a prescription. Yeah. And your world falls apart. It's like, you think to yourself, what do I do now? Is this hang on, I'm not going to over dramatize it, but is this a death sentence? Yeah. Am I stuck on medication? Am I going to lose my eyesight? Am I going to lose my legs or my feet? Yeah. There's loads of things that go through your mind, and all you're given is again, I speak from my personal experience, a prescription and told to take 3 a day. And having the hope for the future is a real big thing.
Well said. I think I'd like to go over some of the myths, because I think myths can affect what course of action people take. And I've put together a few here, if I may. The first one being that diabetes is caused by eating too much sugar. Is that a myth?
It is a myth on its own. Mm-hmm. This is quite an interesting one, because yes, sugar is a big cause. Refined, not necessarily white table sugar,
Right.
But refined sugars in processed foods is a big problem. The big problem is number one, sugar is very addictive, which means that if people consume it, they tend to consume a lot of it.
Yeah.
That sugar can lead, and these are what we call empty calories. So there's no nutrient value in these in sugar whatsoever. It's just calories. That can lead to obesity. Obesity can then lead on to type 2 diabetes.
Right.
So but then environment can come into play, lifestyle factors, physical activity, stress management, sleep. So I go back to my point about it being holistic. It isn't a case of, I'm just going to cut down on sugar. There might be other aspects. It's a multifaceted disease, but yes, sugar is a big player, but it's not the only player in the story.
Okay. What about the biggest myth, I think, just from a novice? I mean, I don't know everything about this. I've done a little bit of research, but overweight or obese people can develop diabetes. Is that true, that the weight is the main decider?
Weight is a factor.
Right.
And I would say from my experience over the last 10 years that weight comes into play in about 80% of cases. Wow. So being overweight and being type 2 diabetic are not mutually exclusive. So I have clients who are overweight, but they're not in fact, they have really good blood sugar profiles. And equally, I've had clients that are 10, 11 stone and had some of the worst blood sugar levels that I've seen. Yeah. So the takeaway there is, yes, if you are overweight, you are definitely at risk or increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Right.
But if you are of a normal weight for your height and your build, please don't fool yourself into thinking it can never happen to you, because it's becoming increasingly more frequent where people who are 10, 11, 12 stone, of a normal weight, that they are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes.
The next one is people with diabetes cannot eat any carbohydrates. I think you touched on this a little bit, but is that a myth?
Absolutely. Carbohydrates are good. Carbohydrates are the preferred energy source of the body. The brain runs on carbohydrates. Right. Carbohydrates, importantly, natural carbohydrates provide fiber, which is good for our gut health and good for our immune system. But what people fail to understand, and I see this a lot on a lot of the Facebook groups, is people are vilifying carbohydrates. When we look at carbohydrates, they fall into different groups, and the natural complex carbohydrates that you find in fruit, in vegetables, in natural foods are incredibly good for the body. And they also come along with other nutrients, vitamins and minerals as well. Whereas the sugary carbohydrates that are in lots of processed food, as I mentioned, they are empty calories. There's no nutrient value whatsoever. They're generally more addictive. They get broken down quicker into the bloodstream than complex carbohydrates do. And then they cause the inevitable blood sugar spikes. So don't be afraid of carbohydrates. Be afraid of refined, processed and sugary carbohydrates. But natural carbohydrates, again, in moderation, too much of a good thing can be a problem. Yeah. In moderation, I encourage people to eat natural carbohydrates from a not wanting to spike blood sugars perspective, but also from a improve your health perspective as well.
What about insulin? Is that the cure for diabetes? I mean, you hear about insulin and diabetes hand in hand. Is it the cure, or are you going to suggest that there are other ways?
So insulin itself, if it's administered, so we mentioned about some very few type 2 diabetics and all type 1 diabetics will administer insulin. Insulin is a medication. It's a treatment. Mm-hmm. Insulin's role its key role is to bring down elevated blood sugar levels. So it's not a cure as such. The body produces insulin naturally. The beta cells of the pancreas, in response to an increase in blood sugar levels, will produce insulin. So insulin essentially is a hormone, and a hormone is a chemical that tells your body to do something. So insulin itself isn't a cure. It's a type of treatment and a type of therapy. The that people can use, particularly as I say, in relation to type 2 diabetes, if other medication isn't working properly.
And finally, on the myth side of things, diabetes is not a serious disease. I mean, from our talk today, it can be, but do people just ignore it? I mean, is it not a serious disease? You can live with it.
It's a very serious disease.
Right.
It's one of the biggest killers, indirect killers, in our society today.
Wow.
When we look at the damage that type 2 diabetes or unmanaged type 2 diabetes can do, it is the leading cause of vision loss in the UK. It's the leading cause of foot amputation. It can cause nerve damage. It can cause kidney failure. It can cause cardiovascular issues. It can cause a heart attack. In the case of my personal journey, it took my dad from me. So yes, and this is the interesting point is, and I will just stress this point for your listeners. Particularly if you are aged over 40, have a HbA1c check done at least every 5 years. And the reason I say that is type 2 diabetes can remain undetected for up to 10 years before it's picked up. If you have a regular, it can be every 2, 3, 4 years, but have a regular HbA1c check done with your doctor as part of your health regime, then if you are starting to go down that route of elevated blood sugar levels, and you can be pre-diabetic and have no noticeable symptoms.
Yeah.
If you are starting to go down that route, they can intervene quickly. And as I mentioned, prevention is far better than cure. Unfortunately, what I see is people that come to me, they've either had a random health check, it's been picked up and we deal with it, or they're having symptoms. And by the time you get noticeable symptoms of type 2 diabetes, normally you've had it for a fair number of years, and normally it's done a lot of damage to the body. Yeah. So the key takeaway there is, as part of your health routine, at least every 5 years, particularly when you get to over 40, just have a HbA1c check done, and hopefully it will come back as normal. If it doesn't, at least you picked it up early, and you could save yourself or someone that the pain that I've been through in losing my dad. Had my dad done that, then
it would have been a different story.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, how can people buy your book or find out more about what you do?
So there's a page on my website that I've dedicated to the book. There's an introduction video, and it talks a little bit more about the book and what's included, including the bonus pack that I put together, which has got over 100 recipes. It's got worksheets. It's got goal setting worksheets. It's got action points. Throughout the book, there's lots of action points. I'm very much, as you can tell, about taking action. There's lots and lots of action points in the book that people can put into action, put into place in their day-to-day lives that aren't difficult. So there's action points, there's habit forming worksheets. There's lots of things there that go along with the book that people can download. So on this page, the website address is www.the-kiss with 3 S's. So KISSS-plan.com. So www.the-kiss-plan.com. And the 3 S's stand for smart, simple, and sustainable, which are the 3 keys to the book.
Wonderful. Look, Neil, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you for joining me today to talk about diabetes type 2. And there'll be a podcast description box for those who are tuning in on Spotify. And this podcast will be available on Jabba Radio from next week. So please make sure you listen in. Thank you, Neil, for joining me.
Thank you, Sanj, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the book and about type 2 diabetes.
My pleasure. Well, thank you to the audience who tuned in today. Till next time, bye for now.